Right. So I made a prediction that the United States would start a war with Iran in order to maintain empire. And that's exactly what's happening. Right now, America is an empire in decline. And we can tell because 5% of white American girls in their 20s are on OnlyFans. Young people are broke. They try to make money on by gambling in cryptocurrency. There's massive inequality in China. Sorry, there's massive inequality in America. Congress is deadlocked. Uh, politicians no longer represent the best interests of the people. America has become an oligarchy. The U.S. dollar has debased in value. And so these are all the signs of an empire in decline. Another sign is an empire lashes out against the world. So the empire engages in these silly, pointless wars in order to maintain hegemony through force and violence. And we saw that most clearly, most vividly in January when Delta Force went in to kidnap Maduro, a sovereign president of a sovereign nation, and that goes against international law. And now what we're seeing in Iran is the same situation where America is desperate. It's trying to save the petrodollar. And to do that, they're trying to knock out Iran and impose a government that is much more friendly to the interests of American empire. And that's what's happening today.
I mean, but how this seems to be destroying the petrodollar? Am I wrong? What am I missing? Ed? How did they miscalculate this in such a way to not see that exactly what is happening would happen? That Iran would knock out their military bases in the GCC states, and it's all over. Then so now they have closed the Strait of Hormuz. So isn't this actually? Did they not realize that they would close the Strait of Hormuz? Did they not realize this would probably kill the petrodollar and even crash our own economy? What do you say to that?
Well, so the major sign of an empire in decline is hubris. When an empire was capable of self-reflection, when an empire recognized the strategic capabilities of its adversaries, an empire would not decline because an empire would engage in innovation, would engage in the self-reflection that was necessary to maintain the empire. So the issue was the 2003 Iraq War, when America, in about 2 weeks' time, was able to steamroll the Iraqis and overthrow Saddam Hussein. But people forget that by 2003, Iraq was a depleted, degraded nation. It did not have air defense, and so it could not protect itself from American attacks. And when Saddam Hussein was advised by his generals to develop air defense, his response was, "There's absolutely no point. We can't defeat the Americans. So the Americans are silly enough to come attack us. Let them. But I don't think they will, because if they knock us out, then Iran becomes the regional superpower." And so they wouldn't do that. But obviously they did do that, and now and that allowed Iran to become the regional superpower of that region. So it's really hubris. You overestimate your own strengths, and you have contempt for your enemies. And that's why we are in the situation. Donald Trump really believed that Iran would be another iteration of Venezuela, where they would go in, decapitate the regime, kill the Ayatollah, and there'll be a new president, a new Ayatollah, who'll be amenable to negotiating with the Americans, and then he would have great television for the next week. And they could not possibly anticipate that the Iranians would be resilient, that they would be so resolved, that the people would be so unified, and now they are in a world of hurt. And Donald Trump himself, in the press conference, said that, "Look, I was given bad advice." He names Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and and Peter Hesef, and saying that they told me that this would be quick and easy, and that's why I did this.
So that do you again? How could even amateurs like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, when it comes to foreign how could they not see this coming? Right? I'm not overreacting. That this is this threaten the petrodollar, or do you think this will end the petrodollar?
Well, it's really a question of what your interests are, right? So we're assuming that they all want to defend the American empire. But let's assume that for whatever reason, they want to end the American empire. They want to cause this disastrous war in the Middle East. America is so embarrassed that it must retreat back into the Western Hemisphere. What would happen? Well, Israel would become the dominant power in the Middle East, and they would achieve something called the Greater Israel Project. And Naftali Bennett, who is the former prime minister of Israel, and who was expected to become the next prime minister of Israel once Netanyahu leaves the world stage, he said that Turkey is new Iran. So this tells you that the Israelis are thinking far ahead, that after this war in Iran is over, they'll still go after Turkey. Why? Because in the Greater Israel Project, which is what they believe that God promised their ancestor Abraham, they will have control from all the Middle East, from the Nile to the Euphrates. That includes Iraq. That includes Turkey. That includes parts of Saudi Arabia. That includes parts of Egypt. So it's really a question of what the end goals are here. Oh. What do you think the strategy and the purpose is here? Because Donald Trump has never really articulated a purpose and a strategy. So that makes you wonder what they're really trying to accomplish here.
Well, I'll give you my guess of what they're trying. They're trying to turn Iran into Syria, meaning they're trying to turn it into a failed state with and divide it up into ethnicities, and so it kind of fights each other over water, and then so they lose all their power, and then the hegemon in the region, the big power, would become Israel. Am I wrong about this?
No, I completely agree with that assessment, and we know because of how America is conducting this war. So the first problem is that the Americans have yet to articulate a clear, coherent strategy, what the military objectives are. And the reason why you want to do that, the reason why you don't want to articulate a strategy is you would then be contained or bounded by your strategy. If it's about helping democracy protesters, then you would not be bombing civilians, right? Remember the first day, they bombed a school, a girls' school in the south of Iran, and they killed about 170 schoolgirls. And now there's credible evidence that it was actually an American Tomahawk missile that killed these schoolgirls. The Americans have struck a desalination plant in Iran. Oil depots that are being used to provide fuel for civilian purposes were struck by the Israelis. And now if you go to Tehran, the capital, it's basically the apocalypse. It's just a black sky. And so if you're intent on helping the Iranians achieve democracy, you wouldn't be doing this. So I think that you're absolutely right in that they're trying to degrade Iran's capacity to be a nation state. And they're trying to balkanize the country and have divide and rule.
And do you think they'll be? I mean, so when they attack things like the water desalination plants or their oil reserves, doesn't that have the opposite effect? Doesn't that make it less likely that that strategy will work of dividing the country, or no? Am I wrong?
Right. So in theory, in a war of attrition, you don't want to do that because you want to turn the people against the government. So when you destroy critical civilian infrastructure, it has the opposite effect. But we assume it's a war of attrition, but it could also be a war of destruction where they're trying to destroy everything, in which case it doesn't matter if the civilian population supports the government because everything is destroyed. So right now, Iran is suffering under a lot of environmental pressure. So if you destroy water infrastructure, dams, reservoirs, desalination plants, then the people of Iran, 92 million people, would be forced to immigrate elsewhere. They would be forced to flee to Europe, basically, and that may be the end goal. Now, I know this is terrible to think about, but it does explain why they're doing what they're doing. We assume that they're interested in regime change, and they've articulated that their goal is regime change. But it's entirely possible their goal is just to destroy Iran as a civilization.
And so let me ask you quickly, is this playing out the way you thought it would play out? And has anything surprised you that has happened or hasn't happened?
This is not this is not turning out the way I thought it would turn out. Because if you go back to the 2003 Iraq War, even though they were intent on regime change, they still went through the bureaucratic protocol process of, trying to win public support, of providing evidence of weapons of mass destruction. Colin Powell made a point of going to the United Nations and making a case in front of the Security Council. And so they respected the Constitution, they respected the international rules-based order, they respected the opinions of the American people. None of this is true in this instance. The vast majority of American people were against this war to begin with, and they're still opposed to this war. There's already rumors of America using ground troops. So it seems as though this government, this Trump government, they have a script in place, and they just want to achieve this script regardless of the consequences, regardless of the political pushback. And that's what's surprising. So a theory is that this is not really a political war. It's an eschatological war. And, we know, and we can suspect this because there's been complaints about this American commander who told his soldiers to be not afraid of this war because this is a war willed by God. This is all part of God's divine plan. And Donald Trump is just a tool, a mechanism in order for God to achieve the end of the world, to bring back Jesus and usher in the Messianic age. And we just look at how the Israelis are behaving. If we just look at how these Christian Zionists are behaving, how Peter Hegseth is behaving, that is perhaps the ultimate purpose of this war in Iran.
So you think that the ultimate purpose for people like Pete Hegseth and let's say Benjamin Netanyahu, do you think the ultimate purpose is the end of the world? So is that really what you're saying? Did I hear that right?
Yes, unfortunately, I am forced to come to this conclusion just based on how the war is being conducted at this point. Because again, from a military political perspective, it doesn't make any sense. The Donald Trump has absolutely made no effort to present credible evidence that Iran is a threat to the American people. In January, he talked about how the government in Iran was killing protesters. And that might have been a legitimate reason, but we never heard anything about this again. During the State of the Union address, he said that he will never allow Iran to achieve a nuclear weapon. And both the Democrats and the Republicans applauded this. But now he doesn't talk about that as well. So it's very confusing as to what he wants. But so we're just forced to assume that maybe there's a deeper, more evil, more insane plan going on. And the Christian Zionists are very powerful people in America. And so what they want to do is this. They want to force a regional conflagration in the Middle East that will draw in the world. When Iran is destroyed, Israel will become the Greater Israel Project and will achieve the Pax Judaica. This will allow certain things to happen. For example, they will be able to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in the Islamic world, and build Solomon's Temple, rebuild Solomon's Temple, the third temple. Then they will bring the Jews back from the diaspora. So all the Jews in the diaspora, in America, in Britain, will come back. And you're like, well, they're very wealthy, they're very, very well established. It doesn't matter because they have mechanisms to force them to come back because of the growing anti-Semitism in America and around the world right now. A lot of the anti-Semitism you find online, it's actually being manufactured. And there are a lot of false flags, right? So for example, the most blatant example is Australia, Bondi Beach. But you will see more examples of false flags against Jews in order to scare the Jewish diaspora to return to Jerusalem. And this is very important if they are to achieve their end times prophecy. And once the Jews are able to build the Greater Israel Project, once they achieve the third temple, and once the Jewish diaspora return to Jerusalem, then this will initiate something called the War of Gog and Magog, where the entire world attacks and marches against Jerusalem. And people can speculate as to what the War of Gog and Magog will be about. But if you just look at what these Christian Zionists are saying online, they believe that Gog and Magog are Russia and Persia, right? A combination of the Orthodox world and the Islamic world will march against Pax Judaica. And at the worst of times, when all hope seems lost, that's when God will intervene to save his chosen people, the Jews. That means the return of Jesus and the coming of the Messianic age. According to Christian Zionists, the moment that Jesus returns, there'll be the rapture, where they'll all ascend to heaven before the final battle commences. And so what they're really trying to do is they're trying to accelerate the end times to force God's hand and usher in the Messianic age. And they believe that that's the true test of your faith. How willing are you act? How willing are you willing to act in order to achieve God's divine plan?